into the Theories of Everything program. I'm David Tower. Viewers, we all know that we're living in extremely critical and dangerous times. There's been enormous discussion in the last year on the effects of global warming, the extreme events such as major hurricanes and droughts and floods, the impact on ecosystems, the loss of biodiversity, etc. So there are enormous problems to face up to. And we broadly know the answers in the large: to cut back on fossil fuel, to reduce the impact on fragile soils and ecosystems, to conserve energy and conserve water. However, putting that broad scenario into practice and slowing down the massive momentum of the 6.5 billion people on the planet going up, as we've discussed in a number of previous programs, is going to be extremely difficult. So every little piece in the jigsaw counts. And in this program we're talking to someone who has part of the jigsaw for Australia and for the rest of the world. That's Professor Michael Archer. Michael is Dean of the Faculty of Science at the University of New South Wales, and of course a passionate zoologist, environmentalist, paleontologist, etc. And together with Bob Beale, an equally passionate journalist, they have just published their book, Going Native, which we'll be discussing on the program. So the thesis is that we should, where possible, we should start cultivating the plants that have evolved here, that do minimum damage to the ecosystem, such as eucalypts, native flowers, native trees, native animals. And the animals, of course, that are most available to substitute for the European animals, the cloven-hoofed animals, the cows and the sheep that have done so much damage to this country, is of course the kangaroo. And as our major source of protein, as a major source of meat in the future. So this will be the topic, this will be the blueprint, if you like, that Michael has laid out, and will be the topic for our conversation today. So I want to welcome Michael, and I want to congratulate him and Bob on this extremely valuable start, not only for Australia but for the world, in how to better manage the major problems that face us, the major ecological and ecosystem environmental problems that face us and will continue to face us in the coming century. Yes, I was very pleased to see it, Michael, because I'd realised that you'd had it on your mind for a long time.
Yeah, it felt good to get it out, I must say.
Well, the thing I noticed first about it was that you take a complete sort of historical view for a start. You go back into your favourite expression or favourite concept of deep time.
It is strange to me that people would even remotely think that 200 years was a long enough perspective to have an idea about what's happening in the country. It isn't. You need at least hundreds, if not thousands, and I would argue millions of years of perspective.
Well, that was the first couple of chapters of your book. You take it right back to Gondwana, basically, and you look at how and it makes sense, because you look at how not only the climate changed as Australia, as the crustal plate yo-yoed between the North and South poles, and across from temperate climates through to the wet type climates, through the sauna type climates.
Complex history.
It's an extremely complex history, and the interesting thing was, all the way through the thread that you make, is that the plants and animals, the biota, had to adapt. Now, they usually had a fair while to adapt, but adapt they did.
Which is different than the situation they face now. I mean, we are changing the ground rules much faster than the world usually changes the ground rules. And that's what's driven us actually to write this book in many ways, is recognizing that the natural world cannot keep up with the kinds of changes we're inflicting on the planet. And yet it's got to. We've got to keep this whole thing together, or we'll suddenly find the ground slipping out from underneath our own feet.
Well, precisely. And I mean, to understand today, I think in our last conversation you mentioned that basically if we're going to understand global warming, we should look at equivalent periods in our past history. And there's been, for a start, there's been 4 major extinction events, and there's been half a dozen yo-yos of climate too, from the tropical sauna to the ice age, and lots of small ice ages and in between and so forth. So there is ample opportunity because of the stability of the Australian continent to be able to understand perhaps what the impact of this global warming might be.
And that's one of the magic things about Riversley, the place where we've gotten these extraordinary fossils that document what happened in Australia. It's on a continent that does not continually get connected to other adjacent continents. So if you try to understand from the other continents' fossil record, what did greenhouse, icehouse, climate changes mean for them, it's complicated by all the continual shifting back and forth of the animals and the plants. Australia has been isolated. So for the last 38 million years, whatever happened climatically to this place is documented brilliantly in that fossil record. So no other place in the world can give us that story.
Well, Riversley has been your total sort of commitment, your seminal base, if you like, in your whole career almost, from what I can understand.
It disturbs me to think about, this year in Riversley was our 29th year at Riversley.
Is that right? Do you still go back?
Every year. We'll be going back again next year, and we're going to have a big party up there, the 30th. But the amount of information that's come out of Riversley that formed our understanding about what was happening in Australia.
So the first discoveries occurred in the limestone at Riversley about 30 years ago, did they, or 25 years ago?
Well, discoveries dribbled out of Riversley ever since about 1900.
Yes.
But our lucky breakthrough occurred really in 1983 when we found the 40 square kilometres of the richest fossil deposits in Australia. As David Attenborough, and I think correctly says, it's among the 4 most important fossil deposits in the world.
Well, that's right. I mean, you've got everything there from dinosaurs to the earliest platypus. Is that right?
Well, much more. We actually haven't picked up a dinosaur yet. We're waiting for that. But it starts at about 24 million and then comes up to the present.
Okay.
But, of course, in the sense that birds are dinosaurs, it tells us a huge amount of everything about Australia's living animals is pretty much documented there, this deep time story. So we have very important stories there about lineage health. We know whether animals today are on a long-term decline or a rise or whether they're staying steady. But it's the bigger issue, the transcendent issue that's come out of that study that drove us into writing this book. And it's that over the last 23 million years, about 44% of Australia's profoundly high-level diversity has vanished for natural reasons. And this is what triggered us to worry, because there is this relationship between biodiversity and the amount of area you've got to develop and maintain it. We wanted to know if there's a natural record of this loss with respect to shrinking habitats.
Yes, I noticed you mentioned that in the book, actually.
It's really important. The question is, are we doing it adequately now? Are we looking after our fauna into the future?
Well, that brings up the whole issue, the whole central core of the book, which is sustainable ecosystems and a whole new, going native, in fact, as the thesis for the book, to come back to. I mean, you mentioned, for example, that the main game is the massive degradation in land, in water, and biodiversity that has occurred in recent times, and the need to, it's unsustainable basically. And it probably has been for some time. And
we haven't faced up to the reality, but
that's right.
I think everybody from agriculturalists to biologists are all recognizing that business as usual is not working.
Well, exactly. I mean, if we take, for example, the huge problem of land salination, for example, that's something that you focus on in the book in a big way. And of course overcropping, and of course all the problems that we face in Australia are currently being amplified by and reflected in the problems overseas with global warming. Basically, what figure did you say the loss of biodiversity has been?
About 44%. And it's biodiversity at the level of families. And a family, say, in Australia would be like all the kangaroos. When 44% of that kind of diversity has vanished for natural reasons, nothing to do with humans. So we have to come to terms with understanding that. And what are the forces that shape this sort of change? And are those forces still operating? And what do we do about it? If we really want conservation to go forward, are we doing the right thing now? And it is a very important question.
Well, we've got what you mentioned, 8% currently conservation, but we need 20% of
on our calculations, if you work from the basis that really to maintain health in lineages, you need about areas of 300,000 square kilometers. Now, those are masses the size of Borneo or New Guinea or Madagascar. If your areas are smaller than that, you don't have that long-term resilience. Little disasters, fires, up and downing of land, eustatic changes, all of these can obliterate smaller areas. So we're creating reserves. We have to ask that question. How big do those areas that we intend to carry our biota forward into the future have to be to make sure that they will be able to do it? And that's where, if you add up the 5 major habitats in Australia, for example, the rainforest, the sclerophyll forest, and so on, you do come to about 1.5 million square kilometers. Has to be in conservation-capable form. That doesn't mean dedicated to conservation. It means the land has to be capable of maintaining the biota, and that is the 20% of Australia.
You mentioned the possible broad sort of solution to this, and again, this would be a global issue as well, as a large portion of Europe is under cultivation, for example, monocultures in America and so forth, is to co-opt or cooperate with the farming community.
Absolutely.
And you mentioned a very radical approach to changing farm usage. What's the framework for that?
It's radical, David, and it's kind of not radical in the sense that every hunter-gatherer community on every continent that managed the land sustainably discovered independently the only way that they could operate with nature and depend on nature and have a future. And that was to value nature, to integrate humans and the environment, to find out how we can work together, rather than what our culture says is, well, we'll shove nature on the other side of the fence and then we'll bugger up this half and that'll be fine. Well, it isn't fine, because on the other side of the fence we find things going extinct. So what we're saying is take the fence down and find out how can we get the grazer to, rather than seeing native things, animals and plants, as pests and problems, to start seeing them as valued assets on which they can actually make an income that'll diversify their resource base for their own economic activity.
It seems an extremely sort of sensible solution. It's a matter of overcoming this massive sort of European inertia, if you like, I guess, with the type of animals, the sheep and the cattle, as opposed to the kangaroos, but also seeing trees as a valuable asset, as you say. And
it seems so obvious, doesn't it? And that, when you sit down and you look at what other people have done, and we filled the book with examples that people are doing on the land in Australia.
Fantastic examples, yes.
And when you look at these examples, you think, my God, why isn't that so obvious? Why aren't we all doing this?
Yes.
And the answer is, as you say, we're imbued with a Mesopotamian ethic. We brought it out of the Middle East with us. It was wheat, sheep, cattle, all the things that were proper animals and plants in those areas. And somehow we never stopped to wonder whether that was the appropriate strategy to inflict on places like Australia.
Well, yes, I think most of my viewers would understand that a kangaroo is eminently more suited to the fragile nature of the land in Australia than large cattle and grazers that pull the grass out by the roots.
Absolutely. It's actually more suitable to the fragility of the human as well.
Yes.
I mean, it's a healthier meat,
2% fat. Or
absolute, 2%, but it's polyunsaturated fat.
Yeah.
No such thing as med kangaroo diseases. I mean, the things that chew the rear end off a kangaroo are not interested in us and vice versa.
Yeah.
So we are so much better positioned to depend on the marsupials and the native species in Australia than these introduced things which we are related to, which we share many diseases with. This is part of the revolution that needs to occur between the ears before a lot of these sort of strategies can begin to have a profound effect on the
I understand, Mike, that kangaroo meat is being proselytised by CSIRO at the moment through the in upmarket restaurants.
And so it should. I mean, we should be not only marketing it in Australia, but all around the world. It's an increasingly valued export meat. I mean, this is the sad thing about it. The rest of the world values our native species more than we do. We're always the last to wake up to this. One of the horrific examples that came out when we were doing this book that struck me, the native flowers of Australia is a $500 million industry globally, and of that $500 million, we're talking Australian flowers here. Only $45 million is in Australia's hands, and the rest. I was in Israel a little while ago. The Messiah Nursery is growing all of our Australian plants and selling them to Europe. What is wrong with us that we're not doing that?
Absolutely. I mean, we mine stuff. and we send it over. We mine iron ore and we mine all sorts of other things.
Yeah, we accept that, but we don't look at the natural resources of Australia. And we can do that sustainably in contrast to some of the other things. We can grow and sustainably harvest and sell. I mean, that is the future of Australia, is to look at strategies of that kind.
Absolutely. You mentioned, of course, a number of other items. You mentioned, of course, that Brazil and South Africa farm more eucalypt trees. They farm those, and for the timber and the oil.
Isn't this madness?
Yeah.
We import eucalyptus oil from Portugal. What happened? That eucalyptus oil was the first Australian export, and so it should have been.
Yes.
And the rest of the world said, wonderful. Promptly started to do better at it than we do, and now we're importing. New Zealand has got our Waratah from New South Wales, and they're growing it and selling it. But they're marketing it under the name of Kiwi Rose.
Yes, I read that in the book, actually.
That's a smack in the head.
That's a plagiarism. That's plagiarism, but we deserve it because we've done nothing.
Unfortunately.
In the terms of we've done nothing to market it under our own brand.
Somebody else is going to value it if we don't.
Brand Native Australia. Well, absolutely. You mentioned a number of things. I mean, you mentioned yabbies, for example. Yabbies are a great delicacy,
Absolutely.
and I imagine they're probably being farmed in Asia at the moment.
And we're in danger of losing all of these initiatives, even when they start with wonderful Australian products, to more entrepreneurial countries that can do this efficiently. I mean, it's not just the yabbies for food and everything, but you even think about native animals. We can be thrown in jail for keeping a sugar glider, and yet I know, because I've had them as pets, they are wonderful. But in the United States, they call them pocket pets, and there's more pet sugar gliders there than there are in the wild here. They know it's valuable. They know it works brilliantly with people. They know it's a more viable alternative than a cat or a dog. Why can't we do the same thing with our own creatures?
Well, the quoll is a good example. I mean, you mentioned that was your favourite sort of
for 5 years.
And ironically, ate a cane toad, is that right?
Yeah,
so
it was an introduced animal.
Introduced animal.
I don't even want to go there. But
I'm sorry I dug that up.
Toads for many, many years. But yes, you're right. That quoll turned out to be a far better companion for people than cats or dogs. And yet, there are strange dark forces in the community that stand up and scream, "You can't do that." They don't know what they're talking about. They don't have.
Let's take the fate. The future of
Australia's threatened ecosystems.
Right.
It's a great acronym, but it makes sense.
Of course it does. Does that involve the universities, the state governments, the federal governments, and CSIRO?
Yeah, it's got to be a whole of government, whole of many kinds of institution collaboration. Now, FATE has been set up here in the University of New South Wales. Right. It's in the Institute of Environmental Studies, but we deliberately did not put it into a science faculty or a commercial faculty because it's all of those things.
Of course
it needs to focus on not just recognizing the scientific wisdom of sustainably utilizing native resources, but also thinking about commercialization, feedback loops. How do you get the win-wins in all directions, from the environment to the people and back again? And that's where initiatives, programs like FATE are critical. And they need to be things driven by the people, but they need to be very pragmatic. We need to know that they are going to produce the income that will provide the incentive, ultimately, for grazers to want to keep native bush and native animals on their property, because, in fact, from some of them at least, they can make a sustainable amount of money. They get resilience out of this.
Well, would the mallee tree be an example?
Oh, yes, indeed. Mallee's a great example. As you mentioned earlier, the salinity issue, of course, everybody knows, is one of the worst confronting Australia.
Yep.
We irrigate too many crops, up comes an old salty water table, and suddenly the land is barren and unable to be used. The wheat fields area in Western Australia, I remember this when I was there in the late 60s, watching these white patches in the fields slowly starting to spread until by the time you drove through Merredin in the 70s, you could see huge tracts of the country that were useless. But what they found in WA is that an old tree, an old standby that they used to think about as a pest, called the mallee, and in fact the stump jump plough was invented to deal with these lumps that were in the ground. Yeah, it was this big bowl in the ground. Yeah. And what they knew then was that it's very hard to kill mallee. When you cut it down, it just pops up again. And that's the asset that we didn't see until recently. But now some grazers have pooled together.
Yes.
And in the wheat fields area, they've discovered if they plant mallee in rows between the wheat fields, the mallee, which has 17-meter root systems, picks up the water that gets
17
past 70 meters, that gets past the wheat. So not only and we're going to have people on the property making better livings than they're making now, and not destroying the continent in the process.
As well as giving hope to future generations and connecting them back to the natural environment.
Their own grandkids can anticipate they'll be able to live on the land.
Yes.
They don't all have to flock to the cities.
And they know where their meat and their vegetables come from.
Absolutely.
Which is sort
They're
of
not born in
losing
plastic wraps in the
right.
supermarkets. Yes, exactly.
Well, that's a wonderful vision, Mike. We've probably just touched the surface of this, and but for the viewers, again, Going Native is in the bookstores as we speak, and probably out globally as well. But it's something that probably everyone needs to read because it gives a perspective on our environment, on the uniquely Australian environment, right from deep time, right to the future. And one last question, Mike: how do you see these initiatives they're actually happening? The awareness is building again through this type of understanding that you've got in the book. Do you see, if we look forward 100 years, 200, whatever, do you see an optimistic future?
Oh, yeah. I want to come back, Matt, because I believe it's the only way forward. Ultimately, we know what we're doing now is not going to get us there, so we have to shift in this direction. It's as simple as that. But what I'd like to think is that this is going to be a shift that won't just involve the rural and regional properties. It will involve the people in the cities too. They will want to go out on the weekends and help on some of these projects to sort of know they're also contributing to the sustainability of Australia. They should be planting in the cities native trees in their backyard. We should be, councils should be reducing the rates of people who...
but we've got no choice now, really, so...
I don't think we do.
And a blueprint, a template of the future is absolutely vital. So this is a very good starting point. So
yeah, we don't... I guess when we wrote this, we deliberately didn't want to write a doom and gloom book.
No.
We wanted this to be the yang for that yin, you know. So, all right, we've heard all the bad stories.
Yes.
What's the way forward?
Okay.
David, there's another example. We talk about kangaroos and a lot of other sorts of things we could focus on, but another one that's interesting to think about, for example, would be the old bustard, you know, the bush turkey.
Yes.
The colonists knew this was a very tasty bird.
All right.
And yet we focus on introducing turkeys into Australia, this North American big bloated, gigantic super fat chook. Why do we do that when we've got these wonderful Australian things? I talked to the national parks people, and that's another thing that needs to change.
Yes.
Legislation has to flex up a bit, so at least we can experimentally explore some of these opportunities. And when we talked about this, I questioned, could we develop an experiment to see if we could sustainably harvest bustards as a potential alternative, market alternative to turkeys?
Chickens and turkeys,
yeah. And they said, oh, yeah, but how would you market it? And I said, it's not a problem. The marketing slogan would be, forget the turkey, eat the bustard. And I think Australians would respond to that.
I think they would.
But we have to open up our eyes and our brain and start to explore strategies that are going to take us into the future. We
do, and there's a limited time frame window to do that in too. So hopefully this will be one of the catalysts that get things moving, as well as FATE, as well as all the other great initiatives that are starting. Well, Mike, thanks again very much. We'll have a conversation on this and other ecosystem topics into the future, hopefully. We didn't even get onto the issues of perhaps how global knowledge through the internet can assist as well in all these technical initiatives.
Different world.
Yep, it's a great world.
And I think to the extent that whatever we do successfully here in Australia needs immediately to be communicated to the rest of the world via that kind of technology. Yes, we can do this.
We can do it. Thanks very much again, Mike.
Pleasure, David.
It's been terrific. I'm David Tao, and you've been watching the Theories of Everything program again. I'll look forward to seeing you again next week.
Everybody, from agriculturalists to biologists, are all recognizing that business as usual is not working.
Well,